You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. This week, we are unpacking the first half of Exodus chapter 7. This is a passage that is going to mess with your theology in the best way possible. Or at least make you uncomfortable. Depends on your perspective, I suppose. So here's what we're going to be dealing with today. God literally telling Moses, I have made you God to Pharaoh. Not like a god, not as if you're God, just straight up, you are God to Pharaoh. Then we have to go back to the topic we addressed several weeks ago now about God hardening Pharaoh's heart. It is a question that has kept theologians up at night for thousands of years, and we have a little bit more of it in this chapter that we need to address. Oh, and yeah, there's also a magical showdown where staffs turn into chaos monsters and swallow each other whole. And if that does not get your theological blood pumping, I don't know what will. So buckle up, everyone. We are about to discover that the Bible is way weirder, way more mysterious, and way more comfortable with mind-bending paradox than most of us ever imagined. Let's dive in. Let's start off reading the first 6 verses of the chapter here. And Yahweh said to Moses, Look, I have made you God to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother will be your prophet. You will speak all that I command you, and Aaron your brother will speak to Pharaoh, that he send the children of Israel out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not listen to you, that I may lay my hand upon Egypt, and bring out my armies, and my people the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh, when I stretch forth my hand on Egypt, and bring out the children of Israel from among them. And Moses and Aaron did as Yahweh commanded them, so they did. All right, let's start with the verse that makes every systematic theology professor break out in a cold sweat. The very first verse of the chapter. See, I have made you God to Pharaoh. Now, if you've listened to the podcast for a little bit now, you're probably used to me saying this, but I'm going to say it again here. Depending on the version you have, this verse may read a little bit differently. And that's okay. It can be annoying at times, especially to those of us who favor certainty and one particular way of doing things, but it's because every translation committee and every translator has a slightly different reason for what they're doing and guidelines for how they do it and theological biases that affect the ways that they translate. So in a lot of English translations, you're going to see something along the lines of, Yahweh said to Moses, see, I have made you a god to Pharaoh, or in the place of a god to Pharaoh, or like a god to Pharaoh. But I don't believe that is the best way to translate the Hebrew beneath this verse. And here's why. There are no indefinite articles in Hebrew. Like in English, we have just the letter A can be an indefinite article, right? If I said the dog, that is definite. If I said a dog, that is indefinite. It is not as specific about which dog I am referring to. Hebrew does not have that indefinite article, like the letter A, that you'll see in many of these translations. So sometimes it just gets inferred in a translation by context, and that's perfectly fine. There are plenty of times where that is an appropriate thing to do. However, the word God here in this particular verse is not the singular El, it is the plural Elohim. I believe we've touched on this several times now, I think actually even in last week's episode, but the plural form Elohim often gets used of the God of the Bible, Yahweh. It can be used in a general sense in the plural to refer to multiple gods from other people groups, like you might talk about the Elohim of the nations, the gods of the other people groups surrounding Israel. But it's not really used in the plural to refer to a single other god. Like, let's say the biblical author was talking about Baal or Ashtaroth or, some other deity that shows up in the Bible other than Yahweh. They wouldn't necessarily refer to that as the Elohim of those people because it's talking about singular. They would call it the El of those people, the God of those people. So that means that indefinite article A doesn't really fit here. We don't use that with plurals. I wouldn't say I saw a dogs or I went to a stores. It just, oh man, that sounds so horrible to me. I feel like I need to go take a shower after saying that. Wash my mouth out with soap for saying those words. That just doesn't work. So that leaves us with really only one of two options in how to translate this. It would either be, look, I have made you God, capital G-O-D, like referring to Yahweh, the God of Israel, or you could also feasibly say, see, I have made you gods in a plural sense, like the gods of the nations around. I have made you like one of those gods. The problem with that option is Hebrew does have a comparative word, a word for like or as, and it's not used here. So that basically leaves us with one option if we are going to faithfully translate the Hebrew behind this. And that's to say, look, I have made you, capital G-O-D, I have made you God to Pharaoh. Now, before you all start freaking out over this, and understandably so, let's look at something that D.A. Carson wrote about this. I don't reference Carson too often, but I appreciate what he said here. And this is in his work, Jesus, the Son of God. He writes, God tells Moses, see, I have made you God to Pharaoh, which of course does not mean that God thinks Moses has become indifferentiable from God himself. The point is that Moses' ruling authority in the relevant matters is the ruling authority of God. Both the NIV and the ESV render the Hebrew, see, I have made you like God to Pharaoh. In fact, every major modern English translation opts for like God, as God, seem like God, all of which renderings are, contextually speaking, semantically accurate and happily orthodox, but entirely lacking in the rhetorical punch of the original. End quote. Did you catch that? Our modern translations are playing it safe. Our English Bibles are wearing theological training wheels when the Hebrew text is doing motorcycle stunts. It's like the difference between someone saying that a person is presidential versus actually calling them the president, whether or not they really are. The Hebrew doesn't soften the blow. It says Moses is God to Pharaoh. And here's where it gets really interesting. Gary Rensburg, in Moses as Equal to Pharaoh, wrote that this isn't just theological hyperbole, it's ancient diplomatic protocol. When Pharaoh, who was considered a god by his people, needs to meet with a representative of Israel, that representative needs to be his equal. You don't send a foreign minister to meet with the Secretary of State. You send your own foreign minister. If Pharaoh is divine, Moses needs to be divine. Rensburg continues, the summit conference between the two leaders of these two peoples demands that the two appear as equals. Accordingly, since Pharaoh was understood to be a god by his people, for the purpose of this story, Moses is elevated to divine status as well. Hopping out of the quote for a second, this is unique to Moses in the Tanakh. There is no other human being who gets elevated to this status of deity. Now, we do have a son of humanity character that shows up in Daniel. That comes to my mind a little bit as a human who is treated as divine. In fact, that becomes Jesus' favorite title for himself in the Gospels, is Son of Humanity, or Son of Man, as many of our English translations have it. Many churches today prefer Son of God, but Jesus actually preferred to call himself Son of Man. That's a whole other topic for another day. And that leads to yet another can of worms that we probably should not open here, but I'll just pull the pin on the grenade, drop it, and walk away to mix my metaphors. Moses may not be the only human elevated to divine status in the Bible, depending on how you interpret the relationship between Jesus' divinity and his humanity. Again, I'm just going to leave that there and walk away for the time being, because that is well beyond what we have time to talk about today. Going back to Rensburg, he writes that the highest level any human being can achieve in Israelite religion is prophet, one who receives direct communications from God. Beneath this rank is the rank of priest, one who receives communications through the more indirect method of Urim and Thummim, or as we'd often say, Urim and Thummim in English. In other ancient Near Eastern cultures, ordinary human beings can achieve the level of the divine in very special cases. The best known example from Egypt is the great sage Imhotep, who was deified by later generations. And the best known examples from Mesopotamia is the legendary hero Gilgamesh. We know him. Parallel cases from Greece include Heracles and Prometheus. In Israel, the elevation of a human being from human status to divine status was certainly heretical. For while the covenant concept in ancient Israel meant that the relationship between man and God was extremely close, the gap between the two could never be bridged. Paradoxically, the other cultures in the ancient Near East viewed their gods as distant, and yet the larger gap could be bridged. The standard theology of the Bible, however, is set aside in the case of Moses' appearance before Pharaoh. End quote. I want you to stop and think for a minute about how this would have played in the ancient world. I mean, imagine you're an Egyptian courtier in Pharaoh's palace, and you're watching this Hebrew slave turned Egyptian prince, turned exile, turned liberator walk into Pharaoh's throne room. You've been taught your whole life that Pharaoh is the incarnation of a god, or the son of a god, depending on the dynasty. And yet here comes this foreign nobody claiming to speak with the authority of an unknown god. And not only that, but he has been made God to Pharaoh. I know, this sounds like absolute heresy, but I promise you, I am not making this up. You can look at it right here in the text yourself. That's just what the verse says, and we have to wrestle with the difficulty of it. The closest parallel I could think of in my comic book riddled brain is from The Boys, when any of the regular human characters take Compound V. That temporarily makes them a superhero, a superhuman. It doesn't necessarily last forever. It just gives you temporary power for a specific purpose. That's the best way I can think of to explain what's going on with Moses here. And if you happen to be under 18 and listening to this, do me a favor and go check with your parents before you look up that reference. I don't want to be getting any angry letters because of this episode, okay? But going back to Moses here, this is not the last time that we will see him equated with God. It's speaking with the same authority as God. And if we look at this in the broader context of the Bible as a whole, where God's plan, his purpose, his drive, is to restore us all back to Eden. From the time that the first man and woman failed in the garden, God promised that there would be a human who can fix this situation, restore us back to Eden. And the text from that point forward is teasing us along, saying, okay, here's a main character I'm telling you about. Is this the guy that we've been waiting for? And then every time there's some massive shortcoming that makes it pretty clear, nope, that is not the person. I would argue this here makes Moses the closest we have come to a human capable of redeeming humanity in the biblical story. But as we will see, and actually have already seen by chapter 7 here, he falls short as well. It's very much a foreshadowing of how, or maybe not foreshadowing, but it's a reminder of how the Bible is trying to get us back to union with God. But wait, there's more. Order now, and oh, never mind, wrong podcast. There is more though, because Moses is not the only one who gets an upgrade in this chapter. Aaron also levels up, because he is now at the official status of prophet. And that should give us pause for a second, because we should be thinking, wait a second, isn't Moses a prophet? What does a prophet need with a prophet of his own? It's like a mini-me. It's a mini-prophet.
Breathtaking. I shall call him Mini-me.
But remember, Moses isn't a prophet right now. He's God, and gods have prophets. So Aaron is playing the role that Moses plays to God, but he's playing it to Moses. The relationships here get pretty complicated, but it is so fascinating to read. And what I find really strange about Aaron's being promoted to this role of prophet as the mouth of Moses is that he doesn't really speak much in the text. So he's supposed to be Moses' mouthpiece, but we don't really see him speaking on Moses' behalf. We have the text saying Moses said this. It rarely even says Moses and Aaron said this, let alone Aaron himself just saying something. Now, it is possible to read that as just implying Aaron's presence there, speaking on behalf of Moses. Kind of like if you have an older sister that goes out to her siblings playing in the backyard and says, Mom says to come in for dinner. Well, Mom is not there saying, come in for dinner. It's the sister who's saying it, but she is speaking on behalf of Mom with the authority of Mom saying the same message that their mom said. So it could be that it's saying Moses said this when in reality Aaron was saying it on his behalf, and it's just that he spoke with the authority of Moses, who spoke with the authority of God. However, the biblical authors were very specific about what details they included and which ones they left out. So I can't help but think that the omission of Aaron as the spokesperson here has to mean something, and probably implies that he actually was not speaking much on behalf of Moses, but rather that Moses somehow summoned up the courage to speak for himself. And the ironic thing is we don't actually see Aaron speaking of his own accord until the golden calf incident in Exodus 32, when he does not speak on behalf of Moses at all. That's unfortunately beyond the scope of this podcast series right now, but it is quite a fascinating passage that I hope to get to at a future point. So 2 verses in, Aaron gets promoted to head of communications, and then just goes radio silent. Now we come to verse 3, where God says, "I will harden Pharaoh's heart." And this is where Sunday school theology goes to die. Or maybe it just makes you want to die. I don't know. Sometimes it's the latter more than the former. God says here, "I will harden Pharaoh's heart." And we touched on this a little bit before the first time that this was brought up, but this is a really complex and can be confusing topic for a lot of people. So I think it's worth coming at from a little bit of a different angle here, because this is the sort of verse that has launched 1,000 theological debates and sunk 1,000 easy answers. So let's have a really tough theological conversation here. I believe you're all up for it, and hopefully I will be here as well. If God already said that he would harden Pharaoh's heart before the first plague even happened, which is where we are right now, and then also even before Moses gave the message to Pharaoh, going back to Exodus 4:21, does that mean that God was removing Pharaoh's free will? And if yes, wouldn't that make God responsible in some way for Pharaoh's actions? I know for many of you listening, the alarm bells are probably going off in your head, and you're going, no, absolutely not. God can't do anything wrong. And I get that, and I appreciate the strong theological foundation that you have. However, we need to be faithful to the text in front of us, and we need to take seriously what it says. We can't just subordinate the biblical text to our theology. Theology comes from the text, not the text from theology. So as much as we might like to pretend that the Bible never has any problematic passages, there will be times that it butts up against our theology and forces us to take stock of what is actually being said and how maybe our theology does not fully represent the biblical message. So I encourage you all to study this, and I mean, honestly, any topic we talk about, but right now we're here. So I encourage you to study this out for yourself. Don't just take my word for it or any other pastor or podcaster or commentator's word for it. Study it out for yourself without jumping to an overly easy blanket answer. Something like, oh, well, God's ways are higher than our ways, or God can do whatever he wants, or God can't do anything wrong. There is no easy answer to balance the scales of sovereignty and free will. This is the kind of theological question that has kept scholars up at night for millennia. And honestly, I think that's a good thing. The moment we think we have God figured out, we've probably reduced him to something smaller than he actually is. But that being said, here is where Hebrew linguistics becomes our best friend. Bet you never thought you'd hear that in a sentence, right? I do believe there is a way we can read these passages and preserve both truths in balance without having God force anyone to do anything they wouldn't otherwise do. Several verses in between Exodus chapter 3 and Exodus chapter 11 talk about Pharaoh's heart being hard. Some say God hardened it, others say Pharaoh hardened it. And like we talked about in our episode on the second half of chapter 4, there are different words used to describe Pharaoh's hardened heart. And in that episode, if you go on the show notes on our website, I link to notes that Dr. Carmen Imes made up for a Bible Project class on Exodus. She has an awesome chart in there that covers each instance of Pharaoh's heart being described as hard, which word is used, and who is the person that hardens it in the passage. Super helpful. I definitely recommend you have that in front of you while going through this discussion here. Because the word most often used of hardening Pharaoh's heart in these 8 chapters does not really mean to harden. It actually means to strengthen or to give extra courage to. So get this, that word is used nearly 300 times in the Tanakh, and only 13 of those times is it usually translated into English as hardened, with 12 of those 13 being in these 8 chapters about Pharaoh. And the remaining instance is almost identical. It just happens to be about inhabitants of Canaan in the book of Joshua rather than Pharaoh here in Exodus. So we have been reading hardened when the Hebrew reads strengthened. And I believe that changes everything. I think it means that we have been reading this text wrong the whole time. What if, instead of God making Pharaoh more stubborn and basically enabling him to sin, what if God was actually strengthening Pharaoh's heart to help him make the right decision? But Pharaoh didn't accept and used that extra strength, that extra emotional courage, to do the wrong thing instead. Here's how I see it. Yahweh wasn't hardening Pharaoh's heart in the sense of encouraging him to make the wrong choice. Yahweh knew the difficult decision that lay ahead for Pharaoh, so he strengthened Pharaoh's heart. He gave him extra courage, hoping that the ruler of Egypt would use that strength for good. But instead, Pharaoh chose a path that brought more death. And he thought it would bring more death to Israel, but it actually brought more death to Egypt. That completely changes the reading of this passage, and each of these passages that is written in English as God hardening Pharaoh's heart. It's not actually God messing with free will. It's not God being the little devil on Pharaoh's shoulder pushing him to do evil. It's actually God providing emotional strength at a crossroads, and because God is not going to control someone, he doesn't force Pharaoh to use that extra strength for good or for evil. Pharaoh makes the wrong decision. And I can't help but think that the linguistic complexity of using multiple Hebrew words to describe this process suggests that the Hebrew text itself resists simple theological categorization. It's almost like the authors of the text were telling us, this is complicated, and we are using multiple words to try to capture the full reality of what's happening. Here's another crucial point I want to bring out before we move into the next verse. This is a descriptive, theological, historical retelling of an account of how God dealt with one really specific, really bad guy a really long time ago. It is not, capital N, capital O, capital T, not a systematic theology textbook stating how he works with people in general. So even if you take a different view from me on what it means for God to harden Pharaoh's heart, the Bible is not suggesting that God would ever harden your heart against him. The text is describing what happened to one particular bad guy in the biblical story, not trying to tell you how God works with all people in all time, or even many people in some times. God is not going to force you to do something you don't want to do. At the end of verse 3, God said that he would multiply his signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. I can't help but think that there is a parallel between how the Israelites themselves multiplied in the land of Egypt and how God now says that he will multiply his signs and wonders in the land of Egypt. I want to draw your attention to one other part of this verse before we move into verse 4, and that's the use of this word signs. We frequently refer to the next several chapters as the 10 plagues. However, that's not what the biblical text calls them. More often than not, the author of these passages calls them signs. The word plagues is rarely used. In fact, only the hail and death of the firstborn are called plagues in the text. So, in general, it would be more accurate for us to call these the 10 signs than the 10 plagues. I realize that probably won't catch on. It's very similar to back when we were talking through the 10 Commandments, and I pointed out that it's actually more the 10 sayings than it is the 10 Commandments if we are trying to be faithful to the text. So as much as possible moving forward, I will refer to these as the 10 signs, but it's entirely possible I might slip up and say plagues because, old habits die hard. But just realize, as we read through this, these are meant to be signs, not just plagues. And I'm not just trying to be pedantic about that. I believe that the word you use to describe these acts of God is going to influence the purpose that you think the actions have. Because if you go into the next several chapters thinking about the 10 plagues, you're mostly just going to see them as judgment or even punishment against Egypt. But if you go in thinking of them in the ways that the Bible itself describes them as signs, well, that's not necessarily as negative. It actually gives us a hope that these were meant to show Israel and Egypt God's power and that he is the true God in this situation. And it gives us hope that maybe Egypt could accept that without having to get all the way to the 10th sign. See, these aren't just random acts of divine wrath. They are communications. They're God's way of getting Pharaoh's and Egypt's attention, of revealing something about the very nature of reality itself, that it is in the hands of Yahweh, not the hands of Pharaoh and the Egyptian pantheon. You'll also note that these are not just called signs, but signs and wonders. And I would have to do more study on this to be 100% sure, so take this with a grain of salt. But as I understand it, a sign has more the idea of a portent of the future, while a wonder has the idea of something supernatural going on. And I tend to think that the terms here are used relatively appositionally, so they're more parallel terms than two separate things, as describing the future acts as being both signs and wonders. Both indications of future actions to come if change is not made, as well as supernatural, I hate to say miracles because these are very negative miracles. I guess it just makes me think of that line from Nope. What do you call a bad miracle, right? Well, that's what we're about to find out in the next several chapters. And here's Robert Alter's helpful observation about verse 4. When God says, I will bring forth my armies, he writes, the opposition expresses a wry and surprising identification. God bears the epithet Lord of battalions, or Lord of hosts, or Lord of armies, Yahweh Tsavaot. But here, the battalions which God calls his own turn out to be the people of Israel. In fact, a mass of wretched slaves who will be fleeing from their taskmasters. End quote. It's almost comedic in its irony. The great army God's military consists of is enslaved brickmakers. But that's exactly the point. God specializes in working through the powerless and the marginalized. Verse 5 gives us God's rationale for what is about to happen. He says, the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh when I stretch out my hand upon Egypt and bring the children of Israel out from them. 5 times in Exodus, God says that his purpose is for the Israelites to know that he is God. Another 5 times, he says his purpose is for the Egyptians to know that he is God. And I personally don't think this was just smack talk of his being like, oh, you don't think I'm the real God, I'm going to show you who the real God is, and now you're going to know I really am God all along. I don't think that's the way God intended that. I think when he said, I'm doing this so the Egyptians will know I am God, I think what he meant was, I want them to know I'm their God too. They think they're following after Pharaoh and all these other gods, but really, I'm still their creator. I'm still the one that loves them, and I want them to come back to me too. Like, this was never about destroying Egypt. Yes, there were absolutely human rights violations called sins that happened in Egypt against Israel before this that needed to be corrected. But God's desire is not to wipe out a people group. And I don't think that drawing this out over 10 signs was to torture Egypt either. I think the goal, the intention, the hope through it all was that this will be the last sign. The first one, okay, hopefully this will be the last one. Pharaoh will get the point. Nope, okay, we're going to do one more and then he'll get the point. Third one, maybe he'll get the point this time. Like, this was not God being vindictive. The best possible way this story could have ended would be with Egypt joining alongside Israel in a new Eden peace together. And unfortunately, we know that doesn't really happen, but I do believe that was the goal here. Alright, let's take a look now at the next several verses, picking up in verse 7. Moses was 80 years old, 80 years old, and Aaron 83. He was 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. And Yahweh spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, when Pharaoh will speak to you, saying, show a miracle for you, then you'll say to Aaron, take your rod, cast it before Pharaoh. It will become a serpent. And Moses and Aaron went in to Pharaoh, and they did as Yahweh had commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent. And Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, now the magicians of Egypt. They also did like manner with their enchantments, for they each cast down every man his rod, and they became serpents. But Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. And he hardened Pharaoh's heart, that he hearkened not to them, as Yahweh had said. We'll stop there for now in verse 13. Verse 7 is the kind of thing that is super easy to gloss right over when we're reading the biblical text, because it seems to be just their kind of filler text. It's not really adding anything to the story. Moses was 80 years old, Aaron was 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. Okay, what's the big deal? Well, hopefully, if you've been listening to the podcast for any length of time, you know that is exactly the kind of thing that we want to be paying extra special attention to. Because the biblical authors don't tend to give us a ton of excessive detail in these stories. It tends to just be the main plot line, a summary of the dialogue, and it just gets on with it. So when the author pauses to tell us a detail that just sticks out like a sore thumb, we should be asking, what is this seemingly random biographical snippet doing here? I have another quote from Rendsburg here, which, I'll be honest with you, it may be a little bit of a stretch, but I don't have a better theory for why this detail is here, so I kind of like what he's saying. You can judge for yourself and let us know in the comments what you think of this. He writes, "At the moment when Moses and Aaron are ready to appear before Pharaoh, the text stops to inform us of the ages of the two heroes. Moses, we learn, is 80 years old at this point. No doubt there is an attempt here at an internally consistent chronology, since the wandering period lasts 40 years and Moses dies at the age of 20. So he's implying that Moses' life can be broken up into chunks of 40 here. He continues, "But the very fact that Moses' age of 80 years is noted immediately before his appearance before Pharaoh is significant, I believe, in light of the following. One of the classic texts that relates the struggle between Horus and Seth, two Egyptian gods, is the late Egyptian story called The Contendings of Horus and Seth, dated to the 20th dynasty. For those of us not super well versed in ancient Egyptian history, that means roughly 11 to 1200 years before Jesus. So possibly around the time this could have been happening, and certainly well before this whole story was edited together several hundred years later in the form that we have it now. So it is possible that this story we have here in the Bible could have been influenced by this Egyptian story, even if they were being initially conceived of around the same time. Okay, continuing on. In the course of the story, Thoth writes a letter to Re'atom, in which he states, 'What shall we do about these two people, who for 80 years now have been before the tribunal, and no one knows how to judge between the two?' As I remarked above, Rendsburg says, the Moses birth story places Moses in the traditional role of Horus, and it transforms Pharaoh into the traditional role of Seth. As the Exodus narrative progresses from the birth account to the initial appearance of Moses before Pharaoh, 80 years have passed." End quote. So, according to Rendsburg, the 80-year detail wouldn't be random. Rather, it's connecting Moses to Egyptian mythology, presenting him as the Horus figure who will finally triumph over Seth/Pharaoh after 8 decades of struggle. Again, that may be reading into it a little bit much, but it is a fascinating correlation. You can decide for yourself whether or not there actually is a connection there. Moving into verse 9, that word translated as miracle in the King James, when Pharaoh will say to you, "Show us a miracle," it is that same word for wonder from verse 3. It's a sign of some sort. He is asking for proof that they are actually representing Yahweh here, that there is some supernatural power behind this random interloper. And what is this sign that God gives to Moses for Pharaoh? Well, it's both familiar and a little different than what we've read before. So let's take a quick break, and then we'll regroup to discuss snakes, sea monsters, and magical showdowns. This is the fun stuff. I absolutely love this. This is biblical theology at its most interesting. At least I think so. Hopefully you will as well. If you've been following along with us in this series, hopefully you will remember back in Exodus chapter 4, Moses was on Mount Sinai, going back and forth with God about his calling to lead Israel out of Egypt, and God gave him a couple of signs to confirm his calling. One of them was casting his rod, his shepherd's staff, down on the ground, and it became what the King James and many translations call a serpent. Now, back in that episode, we discussed how this was not just some garden variety snake. Rather, it was a garden variety snake. Yes, cheesy pun intended. This was not some normal snake. It was the word nakash, which was the same word used of the serpent in the garden back in Genesis 3. And that was not just some random snake like we would see around today. Rather, I believe it was a supernatural creature. And if you want more scholarship on that, there's plenty in Michael Heiser's work that he links to on why this was probably a supernatural being rather than just a snake as we might think of it today or see in the yard. So in the Exodus 4 version, when Moses throws his rod on the ground, it becomes a nakash, a supernatural mini dragon creature, just like there was in the garden back in Genesis 3. So naturally, we would assume that's what's happening here as well. But it's not. This is not the nakash word of the earlier passage. Again, the King James says serpent here, but it's a different Hebrew word this time. It's actually the word tanin, which is a sea monster. So not a land monster like a dragon, but now a sea monster, something like Leviathan from Job, often seen in the ancient Near East as a symbol of chaos. Moses' staff just got upgraded from the garden variety snake to full-blown chaos monster. This is where understanding ancient Near Eastern symbolism becomes crucial to understanding the biblical text. And I know that sounds like just reading the Bible, but with extra steps, but realize that back when this was originally written, its hearers would not have needed all of this background content, because it was their background content as well. They would have understood it. But for us, 2 to 3 or more thousand years later, and half a world away, sometimes we need to step back and learn this background information so that we can understand it as if we were the original hearers. Why would this sign change from the dragon creature, the Nakash of Exodus 4, to a sea serpent creature, a Tanin, here? Well, here's my theory. It's because control over the Nakash would have been significant to Israel due to her origin story, the garden. Remember, the sign in Exodus 4 was for the Israelite leaders to recognize God's authority in Moses. But now, this is to Pharaoh to understand God's authority through Moses. So the Egyptians did not have the same mythology, the same origin stories as Israel. So for Moses' staff to become a Nakash from Israel's origin story would basically be meaningless to the Egyptians who didn't share the same creation narrative. But for Yahweh to control a chaos monster, a Tanin, and then use it to destroy other Tananim, that would stand out to the Egyptians as significant. God is speaking their language, both literally and symbolically. And verse 11 really dials up the discomfort, because Pharaoh calls in his magicians. He summons 3 different groups of people. First are the wise men. These would have been advisors with a very particular set of skills. And that sounded more like Nick Cage and Liam Neeson, but we're going to stick with it. By the way, the last person in the biblical story to be called by this term for wise men was actually Joseph, back at the end of Genesis. Second group are sorcerers. These were wizards, people who had some connection to the spiritual realm. And the third, what the King James calls magicians, those were a specific type of priests, actually, who possessed occult knowledge. Astrologers might be, well, not that doesn't fully encapsulate it, but they're somewhere in between a combination of priest and astrologer. So these were not sleight of hand artists. This was not David Blaine, David Copperfield, Harry Houdini, none of that stuff. These were actual mediums, people who had some connection that bridged the gap between the physical and spiritual realms. And it's really easy for us as modern Westerners to just read over this as some sort of parlor trick. But that is not the way that the biblical text presents it, and I don't believe that's the way that the biblical authors would have understood it. There is no reason for us to soften the blow of this passage. It's telling us that these advisors, these lector priests, as they would be called, or these wizards, actually performed the exact same sign that Moses did. I know that really makes modern American Christians uncomfortable, but the Bible presents these as legitimate sorcerers who, through devotion to pagan gods and some form of unexplained occult practice, had accessed real otherworldly power. So while we believe that Yahweh is the true God, the Bible also presents other Elohim, other powerful spiritual beings, as actually existing in the spiritual realm. The Bible presents them as realities that can sometimes even cross dimensions and share their power with humans. Genesis 6, anyone. We've just sanitized all that because it makes us uncomfortable. But I don't want to be guilty of taming our sacred scriptures just because it makes me feel uncomfortable. Ancient people weren't as stubborn as we are about explaining this stuff away. They just knew it was real. The Bible presents these sorcerers as having legitimate magical abilities because they're tapping into actual spiritual forces. They're just tapping into the wrong team from the biblical perspective. Now, interestingly enough, magicians show up one time in the Bible before this story. And in that story, they're also alongside Egyptian wise men, just like here. Any guesses as to what that story might be? I'll give you a second. It's Genesis 41:8. That's when the Pharaoh at the end of Genesis has some really weird dreams and tries to get them interpreted. It eventually leads to Joseph being instated as the second in command in Egypt. The verse reads, "It came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled," that's Pharaoh, completely different Pharaoh than the one we have now, "and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all the wise men from there. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none that could interpret them to Pharaoh." Okay, now you want to guess the next time in the biblical story that wise men, sorcerers, and magicians all show up together in one verse. It's all the way over in Daniel 2, verse 2. "Then the king commanded to call the magicians, the astrologers, and the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, for to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king." You say, okay, I guess that's cool, but what does that mean? Well, Genesis 41:8 and Exodus 7:11, where we are now, both take place in Egypt. Genesis 41:8 and Daniel 2:2 are connected by both being about unsolvable, mysterious dreams that a powerful world leader had. And that's kind of how biblical theology works. Like, you might not have connected Joseph's Pharaoh with Moses' Pharaoh with Nebuchadnezzar all the way in Daniel, but the Bible does by stringing these little details together. I think that's really cool. It's connecting these different empires together and showing us the progression of the bad guys in the biblical story. The word for enchantments in this verse is also really interesting with the way it connects to a couple other stories, because it actually means something secret, which probably implies a secret knowledge of these magical arts. Where it gets fascinating is that it's the same word used in Judges 4:21 and Ruth 3:7, where women craftily use charm to get their way with men, one to kill him and the other to sleep with and eventually get a marriage proposal out of him. Judges 4:21 is Jael, Heber's wife, took a nail of the tent, a tent peg, a hammer in her hand, went softly, that's that same secret word that's translated enchantments here in our Exodus passage, and smote the nail into his temples, fastened it to the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary, so he died. If you are not familiar with that story in the Bible, it is one of the goriest, weirdest, most R-rated parts of the entire Bible. And then for Ruth, it shows up in Ruth 3:7, "When Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of a heap of corn, and she came," again, the King James says softly, but it's that same word translated enchantments here, secretly, "and uncovered his feet and laid her down." That is its own wild passage that is nowhere near as PG as some preachers have tried to present it. But again, that is a different story for a different day. Now, some scholars have argued that the word enchantments here means incantations or spells specifically, and I think they're right. Moses and Aaron don't use enchantments in the story. They don't use these magic words or spells because they don't need it. They're not bending a god to their will. They're acting on his behalf. Miles Morales, in his book on Exodus, writes this: "When Pharaoh's magicians replicate this feat, with each of their rods becoming a dragon," and that's the word he uses for tanin here, "then Aaron's tanin swallows up theirs," leading one scholar to describe Aaron's staff as dragon-gobbling dragon. As the only other use of swallow in Exodus, and that's when it says that Aaron's rod swallowed up the other rods, that word is used later to describe the Egyptians being swallowed in the depths of the earth beneath the sea, and that's in chapter 15, verse 12. Morales continues, "It is quite likely, as some scholars suggest, that the divine demonstration of Aaron's staff threatened Pharaoh with being swallowed up by chaos, a foreshadowing of the demise of his hosts in the sea. This is precisely the trajectory that ensued with the plagues, which, wreaking havoc in nature, were the steady undoing of Egypt's world, culminating with the Egyptian host submerged in the sea." End quote. There's an article on thetorah.com called "The Egyptian Magicians." It's by Scott, I'm assuming it's Nogel, Noegel. I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce his name. But I'll often throw in recommended resources or connections in the show notes to what we've talked about. And I realize that's like nerdy homework. I am giving you homework on a podcast, and that's not for everyone. That's okay. But if I can just push you a little extra, even if you don't normally check out the show notes, check out that article. It's on the Torah.com. It's called The Egyptian Magicians. It has some fascinating background that helps us modern readers understand what would have been in the minds of ancient listeners to this text. It also has some really cool pictures from ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs and inscriptions that just really help to make more sense of the text. Let me read you a little quote from the article to tease it out a bit. Priests believed that Heka, and that's basically a deification of magical forces in certain Egyptian mythologies. It's a whole wild rabbit hole. Priests believed that Heka could protect them from poisonous snakes and other natural dangers, as the coffin texts make clear. And Nogel cites a little sentence from that. "The serpent is in my hand and cannot bite me." He goes on. A visual depiction of this appears on a number of sippi, and that's kind of a nerdy term. It comes from Latin. It's the plural form of sippus. It's essentially just an engraved stone. So, of course, we can't just say engraved stone. We have to use a fancy term for it. So a visual depiction of this appears on a number of sippi, that's C-I-P-P-I, that depict the so-called Horus of the Crocodiles, such as the aforementioned Meternixstele, in which the young god Horus stands upon crocodiles while holding a variety of noxious animals by their tails, including serpents, thus sympathetically conferring protection on the stele's owner from snake bites and other forces of chaos. End quote. So if you find that interesting, there is a lot more of that kind of information in the Egyptian Magicians article on the Torah.com. Definitely recommend you check it out. There's another odd detail in verse 12 that is super easy to miss, and it's that the text doesn't read that Aaron's tanin swallowed up the tananim of the sorcerers, magicians, and wise men. It says that Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. So there's been theological debate for thousands of years now over whether that's just referring to the fact that this was a rod that turned into a tanin, or some have even gone so far as to suggest that all the rods had now turned back into rods from Tananim, and this was an even wilder miracle because you have shepherd staffs swallowing up shepherd staffs. I think there's probably also a little bit of smack talk going on here, because the word for swallowing in Hebrew can also mean to destroy something. In fact, it's used of the Satan's intentions for Job in the book of Job. So there seems to be a little more force behind it than just that the one rod swallowed up the others. And again, you can check out that article on the Torah.com about the Egyptian magicians for more on what these staves may have looked like. Now, verse 13 might look a little bit different depending on the translation that you're reading. It's another statement of Pharaoh's heart being hard, but a lot of modern translations translate it as a passive. His heart was hardened, something along those lines. But it's not. It's active. It's literally, he hardened Pharaoh's heart, just like it has in the King James. They actually translated it perfectly here. He hardened Pharaoh's heart. And what's odd about that is there is no specified subject. Yahweh hasn't spoken since all the way back in verses 8 and 9. So we have this gap here, and then it just says, he hardened Pharaoh's heart. And you're left to ask, well, who? Since there's no subject provided, is it God who hardened it, or is Pharaoh hardening his own heart here? Well, whichever way you go with it, it is the word here that means to strengthen. So I think it could be either way, probably implying Yahweh, but it's not specified. And again, like we mentioned back in the second episode for Exodus 4, this also ties in with the Egyptian mythology of the Pharaoh having to maintain the creation ma'at, the order of the world, and how in the afterlife, or entering into the afterlife, his heart would be weighed against a feather. So if his heart is too weighty, he's not going to make it into any kind of a good afterlife. There is a translation choice in this same verse, though, verse 13, in the King James, that I disagree with, because it reads, he hardened Pharaoh's heart, that he hearkened not unto them. So that is implying purpose. He hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would not hearken unto them. He would not listen to them. However, it's just a simple conjunction there, and. So the verse should literally read, he hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he hearkened not unto them. So God, presumably, hardened or strengthened Pharaoh's heart, and he, Pharaoh, did not listen to them. There's not necessarily that same correlation causation thing going on. Now, I will admit, it is possible to translate the Hebrew conjunction for and. It's just one letter. It's volv, or sometimes you'll hear wolv. The W and V sounds are basically the same. It is possible to translate that word as that, as a purpose, but it doesn't usually go that way, and I think that's reading a little bit too much in for this particular verse. I want to get just a few more verses in here before we close out for today. I'm not going to make it all the way through the chapter. There's way too much in here to cover in 1 week. So let's just read about 3 more verses here. Starting in verse 14. And Yahweh said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Get you to Pharaoh in the morning. Behold, he goes out to the water, and you will stand by the river's brink against he come. Yes, that's how it reads in King James. And the rod which was turned to a serpent you will take in your hand. And you will say to him, Yahweh God of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, Let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. And behold, you would not hear until now. I kind of hate to stop there because it's basically in the middle of speech, but I think that's the cleanest cut point that we can have for the moment. So let's just take a quick look at these few verses. Going back to verse 14, we have a different word for Pharaoh's heart being hardened than we had in the previous verse, verse 13. So in verse 13, it was the word for strengthening. In this verse, it's the one for making heavy or weighty. I find the use of behold in verse 15 a little weird, because usually when the biblical authors use it, it's essentially like a camera zoom moment in a movie. It's getting you to focus on a particular thing. If you're reading an old King James, it may sometimes just be lo, L-O, but a lot of times it'll be behold, or maybe even look in a more modern translation. And that's exactly what it's saying. It's just saying, look at this. So usually it's moving your focus onto something that is happening right then. But here in this verse, God is telling Moses something that's going to happen tomorrow morning. He says, get to Pharaoh in the morning, look, lo, behold, he goes out to the water. Well, if God is saying, look at this, it usually implies the thing is right in front of you, but this is actually something happening in the future. Unless perhaps more time has transpired in between these verses than it seemed at first, and maybe Moses is standing off in the distance in the morning and he sees Pharaoh there, and God says, okay, now come back tomorrow morning and do this. I'm not 100% sure. I just thought it was a little weird that they chose to put that word in that particular place. We're also now back to saying that the rod became a nakash rather than a tanin. So where it says here in verse 15, take the rod which turned to a serpent in your hand, that is back to using the word nakash instead of the word tanin. Regardless, God gives instructions now for the next encounter, meeting Pharaoh at the Nile in the morning. God is about to crash Pharaoh's pool party and claim ownership of his swimming pool. And even this detail is loaded with significance. Morales draws a connection point here to how Ezekiel characterizes Pharaoh as, quote, the great sea dragon who lies in the midst of the Nile, claiming that the Nile is my own. He continues, such a characterization seems to be at work in this scene as Yahweh confronts Pharaoh while he, dragon-like, wades in the river. As in Ezekiel, Pharaoh here is likened to a huge mythical reptile wallowing in the river. Through the same rod that on the previous day had turned into a dragon, Yahweh will now turn the waters of the Nile into blood, claiming sovereignty over Pharaoh's Nile. As the first miracle and sign put before Pharaoh, respectively, the staff's transformation into a dragon and the turning of Pharaoh's Nile into blood are defining for the epic of Israel's deliverance out of Egypt. End quote. I also think it's a good deal ironic that this is happening in the same river that Moses was supposed to have died in 80 years earlier. And in fact, it's even the same language used of Miriam at the river when God tells him to go stand by the brink, by the mouth of the river. Now, I find it unlikely that it would be the same place that Miriam was, but who knows? She was close enough to see Pharaoh's daughter draw him out of the river, so it had to be relatively close to the palace, I would think. But the bigger question is, why was Pharaoh at the Nile in the morning in the first place? Well, Nogel has another article on thetra.com called Why Pharaoh Went to the Nile, and in it he criticizes several common theories for why Pharaoh would have been there at this particular time. He writes, the most important daily ritual performed by Pharaoh was the presentation of ma'at, which, unlike the other rites, was accessible to at least some of the public. Ma'at was a goddess and a cosmic force of truth and divine order who ensured the regular inundation of the Nile, the protection of Israel's borders from foreign powers, the continual movement of the sun on his daily circuit, and the success of the ruling dynasty. The ritual presentation both commemorated Pharaoh's desire to uphold the world order and legitimated his kingship. But at no time would any of Pharaoh's daily rituals have taken place at the Nile. From pre-dawn until the completion of the morning offering, he would have been preoccupied with religious duties within the temple." End quote. So there have been all kinds of theories proposed as to what Pharaoh would have been doing there, from some grand ritual to just taking a bath. Some have even suggested using the Nile as plumbing, but none of those really hold up to scholarly review. So why is he in the river? Well, I think the best answer is probably just that the Nile was a source of life to the Egyptians, and what's about to happen needs to take place at the Nile, so the authors have to have Pharaoh right there at the Nile for the first sign to occur. So for all we know, he could have just been out taking a stroll, but what matters is he'll be by the Nile tomorrow morning when the first sign happens. As we've journeyed together now through the first half of Exodus 7, I'm struck by how much mystery there is in this chapter, how surreal and supernatural it feels. In the last hour, we have wrestled with a lot of uncomfortable theology. We've explored ancient symbolism, tried to understand spiritual realities that resist easy categorization, and I know none of that is easy. When we're used to hearing a very watered-down version of the Bible in church, this sort of thing can seem fantastical. But that's kind of the irony of it, is this is actually the way the Bible was in the first place, and we're the ones who have softened it over the years. I think these rough edges and difficult topics and concepts to grasp are kind of the point. Biblical authors are far more comfortable with mystery than we are. I think it's okay that we don't have all the answers about divine sovereignty and human free will. Maybe it's okay that the spiritual realm is more complex and dangerous and wild than our sanitized theology suggests. What I really hope you take away from today's discussion is this: the Bible is far stranger, far more complex, and far more wonderful than we often imagine. It's comfortable with paradox, mystery, and questions that don't have easy answers. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what we need too. The God who makes Moses divine to confront Pharaoh, who strengthens hearts that choose evil, who works through chaos monsters and dragon-gobbling dragons, who reveals himself to Egyptians and Israelites alike, this God is bigger than any of our theological systems and boxes we try to shove him in. And that's not a problem to be solved. It's a mystery to be lived. Next time in the series, we finally get to the first sign, the turning of the Nile to blood. And I'd love to do a Q&R soon if y'all have any questions on this series or related things that we have talked about recently. So be sure to send in any questions you may have. We have email, cconn@thebibleuncut.com. We have the website homepage you can write in on, always on the socials, the YouTube comment section, as well as our Discord, which you can find the link to in the show notes on your podcast player. Can't wait to hear from you all soon. But until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.